Chief Landis, there are a number of people in the county and the city who have said, hey, I understand that you don't have all the law enforcement that you need. I'd be delighted to set up a neighborhood watch. What's your general attitude about the pluses and minuses of a neighborhood watch?
Well, as the City Neighborhood Watch program, it's really about neighbors networking and being able to communicate and look out for one another as far as what they see, and then to be able to contact the police when something doesn't appear right. So neighbors that know that someone's going out of town because they're camping and can look out if someone's coming to the home, maybe in a moving truck or a landscaper that's out of place. The more, like in the old days, people used to be familiar with their neighbors and what they did and what was going on, the more you can look out for one another. So our Neighborhood Watch program is in conjunction with having law enforcement available so that neighbors can basically communicate, know what to look for. Our crime prevention officer meets with them at least annually. It also does a newsletter to them about things, trends, stuff to look out for. And that information on the hour.
That's the clock.
Yeah.
Right. I remember that from school.
That helps you know what time it is.
Yes, sir.
And basically it allows for us to update them with suspicious things, fraud scams, things that they can then communicate with one another and be more vigilant in what to look out for. But it's truly in connection with law enforcement that would then show up to help them if something was out of place or wrong.
Well, some neighborhood watch people want to do a bit more, especially out in the county. I'm not asking you about the county, but what would you prefer that they not do in the city?
Well, it's a good question, but I always say it's no different than in some ways for an off-duty police officer, that we want you to be a good witness most times because being in plain clothes, you're at somewhat of a disadvantage. It's kind of like in the NFL, you usually don't see what starts, you see the flag come out with the second. And so if someone was to try to step in to help somebody, not to say that you shouldn't do that, but sometimes you can't distinguish between who the suspect is or the instigator of whatever happened and the person who's trying to intervene to help somebody. And so a lot of times being a good witness, calling 911, that's a great thing. Certainly the county has a whole different challenge when perhaps that response isn't coming anytime soon or at all, depending on the hour of the day and what happens. So within the city, our neighborhood watch groups, what we try to do is the same thing, try to make sure that they know what to look for, that they become good observers to contact police and say, hey, there's something suspicious in my neighborhood, here's what's going on, and then let us be the investigators to go put it together and figure out what may be happening.
Do you think that it's a wise idea for citizens to be doing some kind of patrolling? Not just looking out their window, but actually driving around and saying, there's a guy that looks suspicious, and then go talk with that guy?
You know, that's a tough question because depending on where you live, how rural you are, what type of things have been going on in your particular neighborhoods, let's say, and especially in rural areas of the county. Tough to say what goes on here in the city, which is an urban setting and has law enforcement and stuff. We would certainly not recommend that here. However, out in the county, it may be a whole different setup. If you've been burglarized several times and you're getting tired of it, it's tough to say to somebody, hey, don't start becoming more vigilant and maybe more proactive. The hard part, too, is that, unfortunately, much like what happened in Colonial Valley and other things, not everybody you're going to contact is going to go along, with the program or like the fact that they're being contacted. And they also know there's no law enforcement response. And so sometimes you may bite off more than you can chew. And even though you have a right to defend yourself, that's assuming that you can react fast enough and put yourself in a situation or circumstance to survive. So all those folks out there doing harm, taking other people's property, aren't necessarily people that are going to like being contacted and also know the lay of the land, which means there's not a lot of law enforcement out there in those rural areas. So tough to give somebody advice to say, yeah, that's a good thing. Much like weapons in the home and other things, it's an individual right. It's up to the person and how they want to protect themselves. And in some situations, my mom would be an example. She would not be somebody that would probably be good to have a handgun in the house. She'd probably have it taken away from her and not necessarily be someone who would want to use that as an option. And I think that's why everyone has to decide what's best for them and how they would react. Today in our active shooter scenarios where someone may come into a movie theater or into a school or into a business and start to shoot individuals inside, one of the best trainings that today in response to that is called run, hide, fight. And it's because it gives you options based on the circumstances. Not everybody would be a good candidate to fight or try to take down an individual in that. Some would be better off, depending on the circumstances, trying to run and get away. Others maybe would have to hide in place because of the circumstances. And so having choices and options based upon what may work best for you, knowing all those different situations that could happen and stuff, are the best way to kind of respond and handle those things. So you said to me, do you think it's a good thing to do that? I think depending on the individual, depending on where you live, on all those factors would be how I would decide to answer that.
The availability of a police officer on the scene changes everything in that equation.
Yep.
If you have a 4-minute response time, you're probably better off in many cases making a phone call than to jump into the middle of the situation.
Yeah, and
Makes sense.
being a police officer and having a career over many years and stuff, dealing with confrontations is something we get, I don't like to use the term good at, but we're certainly not surprised when those happen. When you're telling someone, hey, it's time to turn around and put your hands behind your back. If I'm a citizen out in a rural area and I happen to contact somebody who may be up to no good, but they're suspicious, so I'm going to contact them, that bite off more than you can chew can happen in an instant where that person now feels threatened by you. You may put yourself in, they become the self-defense person, and that feeling threatened by the person who stops them, not sure why they're stopping them, that kind of thing. So it has an escalation and a weird situational, as we say, a dynamically, rapidly changing situation as soon as those two parties become...
Widely variable.
Yeah, and so it's very tough to answer to someone, would this be a good thing or not a good thing? Somebody who's short-tempered, that's tired of getting burglarized, goes out, and maybe it is somebody who's just passing through the neighborhood, but by gosh, they're tired of being a victim, and they confront them, and that can have an interesting thing. Or by chance, that is the guy that's been burglarizing, but he's carrying a weapon, and that ends badly, and we see things like that happen from time to time. So it's not a good situation.
And in this scenario that we're talking about, you're probably better off staying on your own property instead of engaging them out in the public or on the neighbor's property or.
But then what happens to the idea of a community where you're watching over your neighbors?
It's a great question that you asked, Dale. And I
I'm
think,
glad he keeps saying I'm asking great questions. That makes me feel real good.
well, because they're thought-provoking. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is, it's interesting to be in a situation where typically what many people do across the United States is they're able to pick up the phone and call. And in some areas, much like today in rural Josephine County, that's not necessarily the case. So now we're at a place where we're trying to answer that question, what should we do, or how should we react to that or respond to that? And I don't know that there's a cookie-cutter answer or a great answer either way to those scenarios. I think what Mike said was right. Staying on your property is always the best thing. You certainly have a right to protect yours and, let people know that, hey, this is not a place where I want people trespassing or being a victim of having my property stolen or what have you. And once you step off that property, it gets a little dicey, especially if that person just happens to be somebody who doesn't like being contacted by somebody who's, wanting to know what they're doing.
Or, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Or if they're in public, walking by on a public street, they have every right to be there. And so you contacting them perhaps in an aggressive or...
What they perceive to be aggressive.
way, it can, provoke violence.
Somebody that pulls up in a vehicle you don't know, even if it's, say it's you walking down the street, and wants to know what the heck you're doing, already has, a bad tone to it. When you feel like, wait a second, who is this that I need to be answering?
Have we been properly introduced?
Yes, that's right.
Right.